Welcome back everyone. Let's go ahead and take a look at another iPad that Apple made a couple of years ago and see how this bad boy holds up in 2022. Now this time around we're looking at the iPad 5th generation, which is actually very interesting because the iPad 9 came out a couple months ago, and in my opinion these are some of the best iPads Apple makes. I mean, they're definitely not like the most powerful ones, but they have the best value per dollar I've seen from most iPads nowadays, to be honest. Now with this iPad 5th generation, it's still a pretty decent iPad, I will say, but there are definitely better options out there for, decent values as well. So I would recommend going up a little bit, maybe to the 7th or 8th gen, but that's kind of where I would put this specific use case at. I will leave some links in the description for some iPads too, so you can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now starting off with the outside of this iPad, we do have a beautiful 9.7-inch Retina display, and in my opinion this panel still looks pretty good. There really isn't too much to complain about with this type of bezel, with this type of panel. Now this is a couple of years old as of now, but another big thing to keep in mind is that even with the iPad 9th generation, there's a little bit of a different design change Apple did with this specific design. There's thicker bezels on this one than even on the iPad 8th generation, I think, when they switched it. So keeping that in mind, you do have to remember that with something like the iPad 5th generation, it's not a dated design by any means, but it is a dated design when you think about it. So that's probably the best way to put it. It does look kind of like the iPad 9, but it definitely doesn't look anything like an iPad Air 5 or like an M1 iPad or an M1 iPad Pro for the most part. So keep that in mind, but regardless, it's still a good feeling looking iPad. On the bottom we have a lightning port with a headphone jack, which is really cool. On the back, the full aluminum back, which still looks pretty good, not anything to complain about. Single camera setup on the top left as well. And one thing that I've said continuously is that this design isn't really that bad, and it doesn't feel like a cheap iPad. Something I've been seeing and saying for so many years now is that Apple has never really made a cheap feeling iPad. They've made iPads that maybe aren't as powerful internally as they should be, but these iPads still feel extremely premium, and I for one, I'm still a huge fan of every single iPad that Apple has made, and they've never made a cheap feeling iPad. So that's a big statement I want you guys to remember. So if you're picking this iPad up, you're not going to think it's like an outdated or cheap feeling iPad. There are things within this iPad that definitely don't look or perform as great as they used to. The internals, maybe the display not having 120 Hz or anything, but I think it's a decent panel for sure. So in terms of that kind of covers it up on the outside. Now hitting on the cameras, this thing has a front camera and a back camera as well. Now I will definitely tell you the camera setup on this thing isn't like the number one reason to pick this device up. I mean, it has, a single 8 megapixel camera on the back, and it has a 1.2 megapixel camera on the front. And this camera setup is pretty much almost identical to an iPhone 6. So just imagine that for a second. Would you use an iPhone 6 in this day and age? Well, for every single task, probably not. But for things around the house, like for having an iPad that's handy, that you can go and pick up a FaceTime call with, that's actually pretty relevant. And I'm actually a fan of that for sure. So that's a big thing to keep in mind. Personally, I think something like an iPad Pro's camera that has like center stage, even the iPad 9 nowadays has a really good camera setup inside of it. So I'm personally a fan of the newer cameras we have, but with something like the iPad 5th generation, it does sit kind of in an interesting situation where it's not that amazing of a camera, but it's super handy to have some sort of camera like this on an iPad where you can go and take things like FaceTime calls or other meeting calls if you have to. So I think when it comes down to it, this camera, it's good to look at this iPad as a tablet that has a camera with it, not necessarily as oh, I'm going to use this camera for everything. There's really nothing crazy you can do with it. You can do 1080p video on the back, I think 720p video on the front. Other than that, there's really not a huge reason to look at this specific camera and pick it up because of that specific thing. So in terms of that kind of covers it up in the camera standpoint. Now another big thing about this iPad is actually with, I guess, the performance a little bit, and this iPad is still being supported with software, which is always good. It has that A9 chip inside of it, so it's still going to be supported for probably the length of iPadOS 15, but it's not going to be supported probably that much longer. This thing is going to last pretty much as long as an iPhone 6s. So you have to kind of keep that in mind when you're picking up a tablet like this. You don't want to go and buy an iPad that's already going to be outdated, and with this type of iPad, to be honest, you're kind of in that boat. It's already kind of an outdated machine. It's not a horrible machine by any means. It's not outdated like completely. It's still supported right now, but it really depends on how long you're planning on using this iPad. If you're still using this iPad right now, then I would highly recommend waiting until the next iPad 10th generation comes out. That way you can snag either that iPad or you can pick up a cheaper iPad in the used market and probably get a better machine in that standpoint. But if you're somebody who is actually planning on buying this iPad today and you want it to last you, many years to come, well, this is probably not that iPad for you, to be completely honest. And I would recommend going at the bare minimum something like an iPad 7th or 8th generation. Those are going to be way better iPads that I would highly recommend you to buy, just because they are more powerful than this thing, but they're also going to be giving you a longer supported software versions on those iPads than on this one. Although this one is still supported for now, I don't know how much longer that's going to last, and that's probably where I'm going to leave you at when it comes down to this iPad. So in terms of that specific situation, that kind of covers it up there. Now in terms of performance, there's really not a whole lot else, with this tablet that is super relevant besides the performance, in my opinion. Now in terms of performance, this thing has that Apple A9 chip inside of it, and it has 2 gigabytes of RAM, which, like I said, is a good amount of RAM to have on an iPad. Even though we're in this day and age where iPads, I think, go up to like 12 gigabytes of RAM now, this thing is still at a decent, chipset level where the Apple A9 chip isn't severely outdated. Like I mentioned, it's still supported with software, which is really good to see. But a big thing to keep in mind with something like the iPad 5th generation is that it's not necessarily going to be the most powerful machine, and I'm starting to see a lot of these machines starting to show their age. Now on iPadOS 15, you were going to be getting a severely different experience than most people will probably recognize, because if you picked up an iPad 5 that had iOS 12 on it, it's definitely going to be much smoother than if you picked up an iPad 5th generation with iPadOS 15 on it. So I say that to say, if you're getting an iPad 5 and you're planning on using it for every single thing you're going to use it with, well, that's another, I will tell you, the performance may not be as good as you may have thought so, a few years ago. So with this specific iPad in place, I don't think this is the iPad you should go and pick up if you're trying to get the most amount of performance. But if you need something that's kind of like a device you're going to use every once in a while, you need like an entertainment device if you want to watch YouTube videos and stuff, or you need something to kind of sit there that you're not going to use too much, that you can like stream something on or whatever, then this is not a bad iPad. It can pretty much handle everything you're going to do there. But if you're trying to use this iPad as your main device for every single thing you're going to do with it, like video editing and gaming and all that stuff, this isn't really going to be that capable of a machine. And I hate to say it, but that is pretty much the truth. Some of these older iPads with these older chipsets are no different than their iPhone counterparts. So even though the iPhone 6S was technically more expensive than when this thing came out, and you can probably buy these in the same use, and you can probably buy them for around the same price nowadays, I would still recommend the iPad 5. I would still recommend other iPads that are higher end than this one, just because of the performance level that you'll probably be getting from an iPad 7 or 8th gen, especially the 8th gen, than from this thing. So in terms of that kind of is how I feel with this specific iPad. Again, not the end of the world, but I don't think you should be picking up this iPad if you want to have a super solid machine in terms of the performance segment. Now in terms of battery, I always found that these iPads had really decent batteries in them, and with this specific battery, it's a decent size. It's not like a crazy big, long-lasting battery life from these type of iPads. But one thing that I mentioned before is that, iPads tend to have really good battery life, amazing standby time, and this is no different. iPadOS 15 has taken a toll on a lot of iPads, but I think it's a decent option right now. So in terms of that covers it up there. And to be completely honest, I don't really think the iPad 5th generation is the first iPad I would recommend people buying in this day and age. I think something like I probably mentioned 45 times already, the iPad 7 and the iPad 8, I think those are better options than this thing. Again, that's not to say that this iPad is a really bad iPad or it's an amazing iPad for the price. It's really kind of one iPad that I think gets overlooked a lot. And this is probably one of those iPads I will not recommend buying anymore. If you have it, I would recommend using it and keeping it forever. But if you don't have it, then I would recommend overlooking this one and probably go to something like an iPad 7, 8, an iPad Air 4 if you can get it around. Even an iPad Air 3 is going to be better than this thing too. So that kind of covers it up. If you guys have any other questions or anything, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.